and thanks to the Minister, and thanks to the All-Ireland Food Poverty Network for inviting me here this morning. And I'm delighted to be able to share the findings of this report with you, which we've been working on now for about 18 months. So this is the end product of a lot of work by our team. So I'll just give you a brief overview of what I'm going to discuss. So I know Sophie's going to talk a little bit later on about framing and different ways of framing and different ways of communicating food poverty. I'm also going to give you a bit of a primer into the concept of framing, and I'm going to get you guys involved as well. I have a little experiment I want to run to see if we can explore the power of framing together. Then I'll just give a brief overview of the project aims and the methods that we used, and I will share some analytical observations that our team made of this project. And then we'll discuss some of the recommendations that were made, and these were collaboratively generated in consultation with various stakeholders, including staff at Safefood. And hopefully we'll have a bit of a discussion around those then. Okay. So first off, what do we mean when we talk about framing? So to illustrate the power of framing, I thought we could kick things off with a little bit of audience engagement, because I don't really like public speaking, and I'd like to get you to do a bit of work this morning, okay? So let's get you folks involved. So let's say you're doing the food shop for the week, and you know you need to restock on coffee. You're on a budget because payday is another week away, and you're in a rush. You've only 20 minutes left on the parking meter. So you're in the coffee aisle, you see two identical products, and both appear to be promoting special offers. So product A says buy one, get one free. Product B says buy two, pay 50%. So by a show of hands, and quickly, remember the parking meter is running, you're in a rush, which one do you go for? Product A or product B? Hands up for product A. Okay, and for product B? Okay, so vast majority of us chose product A, right? Okay. We'll do another quick one, and then we'll suss it out together, okay? You're on the same shop, and you have to choose a stain remover. You're doing a big clean before kids are back to school, the house is a mess, you need to do a big clean, okay? So which one do you go for? Product A removes 95% of all stains, or product B, effective on all but 5 stains? Okay, so show of hands, product A. As we might have expected, okay, all right? So why do we think that is? And you feel free to shout up if you want.
It looks more, even though it's exactly the same. It appeals to some non-conscious sense that it's a better deal.
100%. So when we think of the first example, buy one, get one free. Buy one, get one free is very straightforward. You don't have to think that much to understand the benefit there, right? You don't have to think about what the gain is. But our brain has to work a little bit faster to work out the benefit in the second option, right? Buy two, pay 50%. So, and our brains like shortcuts, especially when we're making decisions, okay? In the second example, something similar, but also something slightly different. So the messaging on product A is positive framing. So it tells us the success rate of the product, whereas product B, the message tells us the failure rate. So having that, you were more likely to lean towards the positive framing, and even though each of the products have the same rate of effectiveness, okay? And some of you might say to me, okay, Elena, but numbers are tricky and hard, and I didn't like my maths teacher in school, she was a wagon, so, you know, and I have to think a bit more with these examples, okay? But framing does occur across more than marketing. So let's take this description here. So for instance, let's say that each of the people pictured in these images could be described as a person who lives or works on a long-term basis in a country other than their own. By the way, I swear I'm going to get into food poverty eventually, all right? Okay, so that's an accurate description or a statement of truth that can faithfully be applied to each of these groups of people. If I say to you the words expat, digital nomad, migrant worker, all of these can be defined as people who live or work on a long-term basis in a country other than their own. But those monikers Those specific monikers will signify realities and truth conditions that are shared, but nevertheless quite distinct from each other. And you will be able to easily match up each of those monikers with those pictures there, right? Because you've probably been exposed to them before, you've been primed, so you have that association in your mind, okay? So that's one example. But then besides marketing, the text and cultural outputs in which we may notice framing most frequently will be in the mass media, okay? So sometimes framing is used to convey a particular slant on a story, and this may or may not be driven by a bias or by an ideological perspective, and perhaps a desire to set a particular agenda. It can also be driven by other factors, though. So habit and tendency towards a particular narrative or storytelling strategies. Could be about journalistic practices and conventions that have just become established and routine. And it could be about perceptions of what audiences want or what they need, or what editors or producers perceive them to want or to need, or what they perceive will sell papers, get clicks or likes, or a greater audience share. So regardless of the motive for the framing, it does play a role in how we perceive a particular story or a particular issue, and can nudge us into adopting different perceptions and different points of view. And I think Sophie's going to be talking a lot more about that a little later. But in the example that I have here, you see two headlines reporting on the same story from, I think, a couple of weeks ago. So both of these outlets were reporting on the release of the US jobs report, which is considered a health marker for the US economy. And if you're like me and you haven't a clue about matters of the economy, and you were to open up your phone in the morning and to read these news stories, and let's say the first one you happen upon was the Yahoo Finance report there, you'd probably think unemployment has fallen, there's more jobs created, you know, this sounds like good news, or at the very least it doesn't sound like bad news. But if you open up your phone to the Forbes report, you might take a different view altogether. So they've omitted the raw figures, they've explicitly used negative language, and they've employed this weather metaphor that kind of evokes a sense of a bad forecast, okay? So you probably come away with two completely different ideas, especially if you lack other context for making a judgment. So what we see in the media then, in the mass media, what we see in framing in the mass media and in that prior example, is how information is selected and made salient to produce a particular view or to elicit a particular emotion, and in the process often to set a particular agenda. So this is how political scientist and professor of communications, pictured here, Robert Entman, described framing as a process of selecting aspects of a perceived reality and making them more salient when communicating. So in other words, this is what to highlight and what to omit. So as we saw in the last example, certain aspects were highlighted and certain aspects were omitted. So through this process of selection and salience, one can promote a particular definition of an issue, a particular interpretation of the causes or the drivers of that issue, and a perspective then on measures and how to address that issue. So in this project, which I swear I'm definitely going to get into right now, this is the understanding, so this is the conceptual framework that we use to analyze the data gathered and that we use as sort of a structuring mechanism throughout the report. So just to give a brief overview of the project aim, so as we know, the project was funded and commissioned by Safefood and carried out by our research team. So this included researchers and academics from UCD, from Ulster University, and ourselves in the Health Promotion Research Centre in the University of Galway. So we have here today Dr. Sinead Fury and Dr. Aideen McCartan from Ulster University, who lent their expertise in food poverty specifically and in media studies. We also had Dr. Pora Kerrigan from UCD, who has expertise in media studies also, and then Dr. Claire Kearns and Professor Colette Kelly from the Health Promotion Research Centre, my colleagues, who have expertise in evidence synthesis and qualitative methods. As Aileen said, my own background is kind of different. It's in HIV-related stigma, but my PhD examined representations of HIV in the media, so there's sort of a bit of a methodological overlap there. But this was very much a team effort and very much a collaborative project and an interdisciplinary effort. And so the overall aim then was to investigate how food poverty is framed in the media, and then also to explore public policy and key stakeholder perceptions, both of the issue itself and how it's communicated. So the project was divided into 3 core data collection work packages. I won't spend too much time on methods. I want to get stuck into the findings. But the work was spread out across the team and kind of according to our particular specialities. So this included a policy analysis work package where we gathered and analysed 48 relevant policy documents from both Northern Ireland and Ireland. And we also gathered and analysed 172 news articles or broadcast segments from national and local news media across the island. It's not noted in the image there, but at the end of the project, we also conducted 2 stakeholder consultations. And during these, we sought feedback on the project, and then we collaboratively generated the recommendations that I'll discuss at the end. Now, I'm mostly going to focus on the media findings, given that the topic of the day or the event more broadly is on communication rather than policy per se. But just to nutshell very, very briefly what we found there was that poverty was broadly defined as a lack of access to affordable food or food insufficiency, and very much often linked to the ability to maintain health. There was also an emphasis within policy documents, however, on food bank reliance, and then to an extent linked with exclusion from cultural and social participation. We found that the measures to address food poverty were mostly presented or circumscribed as involving food aid and including the redistribution of waste or surplus foods. And it was noted that while both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland have anti-poverty strategies, and there was some evidence of kind of cross-governmental coordination, neither had a food poverty strategy per se. There's a full chapter on the analysis, however, in the report. There's a really comprehensive summary of each policy document in the appendix, and there's expert analysis of the policies in both jurisdictions conducted by Dr. Fury. So for those interested specifically in that topic, I suggest you take a look. But for today, again, because we're focusing on communications more specifically, I'm going to rather focus on what we found in the media data analysis. And then I'll contextualize that with what we learned from the interviews that we carried out. So insofar as the media data was concerned, we sampled a broad range of material which was published or broadcast between 2018 and 2023. So for the broadcast news media pieces, and in the context of the island where we have dual reception and a lot of content is brought in from other places, we adopted a production cultures approach. So that's to say the broadcast had to originate in the island of Ireland. We included 91 radio and TV segments, and this included content broadcast on TV or radio or sometimes published online. Only national broadcasters were included, so this would have been the likes of RTE, BBC Ulster, UTV, and then the national radio broadcasters too. For the print news media, we included a mix of local and national news outlets, so we had a really, really good cross-section of the type of content that the people would be seeing in their locality, and then nationally as well. So in addition to the likes of, say, the Irish Times and the Belfast Telegraph, we would have had smaller regional publications like the Connacht Tribune, Derry Journal, among others. And again, that full list will be included in the methods chapter of the report, which you can read. Now, I'm going to get you guys to do another little bit of work. But first, as a reminder of Entman's framing theory. So this is the approach that we took to structuring the analysis of the texts and the broadcasts. And so what we did was we looked at how is the issue defined, what are the drivers attributed to it, and what are the solutions that are highlighted. And we also wanted to consider as well whose voices are being platformed in these texts and in these reports, okay? So I'd like you guys to do a little bit of work. I have 2 clips that I'm going to show you. And I'm going to play them for you. We'll play them back to back. And then I want to just maybe go out to the audience and see what you think. What do you think, how do you think the issue is defined? How do you think the drivers, or what drivers do you think are attributed to the issue? What solutions do you see are highlighted and which are not highlighted? And then also which voices are platformed. And then we'll see if your analysis matches up with ours. Okay, so we'll go into the first clip.
When food banks are running out of food, there's a problem. At Cherry Orchard Community Centre in Dublin, St Vincent de Paul cannot keep up with demand. It's got to the point where those who once donated to the charity are now seeking its help.
They are now coming collecting food. Maybe not every week, but maybe, every 2 or 3 weeks, Ellen, how are things today? Are we running short of stuff?
We are running short.
Okay, we might have to buy in some stuff.
A St Vincent de Paul volunteer for 40 years, Mary Cronin has never seen the situation as bad.
Things were bad in the 80s, there was various recessions, but this is the worst. I've never experienced people that were working that weren't able to. Of course you would get, people with mortgage problems and this, that and the other, but not to the extent that we're getting it now.
This other room in the food bank is used for emergency supplies, but such is the demand over the last 6 weeks, the shelves here are empty. The rising cost of food and energy in particular is pushing households to the brink. A new report by the social justice think tank TASK says lower socio-economic households are being impacted the most.
The lower your income, the more or the greater share of your monthly budget you actually spend on energy. So that's why, even though everyone is being hit hard, that's why it tends to be the lower income households that are hit more.
Those households are turning to charities like St Vincent de Paul for help, and it seems an increasing number of middle income households are doing the same. Alba Keneally, RTE News.
Okay, that's the first one, and I'll play the next one.
The need for food banks has never been greater. With food, electric and gas costing more, people are under real pressure to make ends meet.
The first 6 months of this year, food banks in the Trussell Trust network in Northern Ireland handed out 32,000 food parcels. That's a 25% increase on the same period last year. And the most shocking fact for us is that 10,000 people accessed food banks in Northern Ireland for the first time in the first 6 months of this year as well.
And these figures don't even represent the full picture. With other independent food banks across Northern Ireland operated by community and church organisations, the number of people needing help is thought to be much higher. The cost of living crisis is having a huge impact on who is using a food bank. The Trussell Trust say 20% of those using theirs are from a working household.
Really, this past, I would say, 3 months, we've seen a lot more working families. So families that are just earning enough, but they're just earning that bit too much to go into benefits, whether that be free school meals, school uniforms. And now with the cost of living crisis, it's just putting people over the edge. As I mentioned, we've an 88% increase in the food going out. We have seen an increase in the donations, but that's a 26% increase. So we have that gap that we're trying to manage now of, 62%. So really, just as the winter unfolds, things will get harder.
The Trussell Trust are urging the Northern Ireland Executive to get back around the table to help with the cost of living crisis. And with no sign of it easing, food banks here are set to have their busiest winter yet. Kelly Bonner, BBC Newsline in Bangor.
Okay, so a lot of similarities between those two pieces, right? And from your perspective then, and I think we have a microphone if somebody wants to jump in, but what were the drivers that were emphasised? So thinking about Entman. Anyone want to shout? Yeah?
The cost of heating, cost of food, the cost of living crisis in general.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about the measures that were to address it? Which ones were highlighted? Or what was the most dominant kind of frame that was coming through there in terms of the measures to address food poverty? Whose voices did we hear from the most? You can just shout out, we don't need to. Anyone? Charities, right? Yeah, okay. Right, so this is more or less what we found as well when we analysed the data. So we found that in terms of how food poverty is defined, that it's very often defined in relation to the cost of living crisis. And remember, we sampled media pieces from the past 5 years or so. So very much defined in relation to the cost of living crisis. The causal factors that were highlighted then tended to be things like inflation. In the Republic, very often the housing crisis might have been mentioned as a contributing factor. In the North, as we saw in that latter clip, there was mention of the lack of a government instalment, and which there was at the time. The minister's gone now, isn't he? And so, in other words, all of these things are upstream factors, upstream of the problem, right? So they're at the macroeconomic level, they're at the policy level, they're at the societal level, they're out of control of much of us as individuals, right? And then in terms of the measures that we see, however, that are highlighted, the focus is on food banks, the focus is on community initiatives, and then a much vaguer focus or much vaguer emphasis on government interventions. Because community initiatives can't fix macroeconomic problems, right? And then in the terms of the voices that we heard that are most prominently platformed, we saw a great deal of focus on those of the coalface, so people working in these community initiatives and these social solidarity movements and food banks and so forth. Likewise, when we looked, so this was from the broadcast media, but likewise when we looked at the print media, we saw pretty much the same thing. So again, a linking of food poverty with the utilisation of food banks, really in such a way that they're almost entirely synonymous with one another, okay? We also found then that there was a significant emphasis on upstream factors in contrast with individual factors when we're looking at drivers. So drivers such as the cost of living, inflation, income, all of these are mentioned significantly more frequently than individual factors such as budgeting, knowledge, so forth. So you can see the figures there. Upstream factors were mentioned in 65% of the articles that we analysed, as opposed to individual factors, 20% of the articles. Similarly, measures to address food poverty in the print media analysis, we found that third sector responses were mentioned in almost 4/5 of articles, whereas policy responses in only 2/5, okay? And similar to the broadcast media, we found that the voices that were most prominently platformed tended to emanate from that voluntary sector, the third sector. We can also take a look at a time analysis of reporting on food poverty and how there tends to be patterns here. So for example, here we see spikes in reporting at specific times of the year, so close to Christmas, and during the summer months, sometimes when children are out of school, for example. And more broadly then, that reporting tends to be episodic and triggered by events such as fundraising efforts or a Christmas donation appeal or the launch of a report, like something like today, or release of data. And then also very much contextualized again in the past few years in relation to the cost of living crisis. Okay, so in order to help us make some sense of these patterns of reporting and to better understand the framing that we saw in the news reports, as I mentioned previously, we carried out a series of interviews with a range of different stakeholders. So this included media professionals working both north and south in a range of production, journalistic and editorial roles in print and broadcast media. We also spoke to members of the public, and we spoke to people who were working in these third sector community and voluntary organisations. And finally, we had a couple of Ford policymakers who also made time to talk to us. So in the report, we go into quite a bit of detail on the views and perceptions of food poverty of each group of people that we spoke to. And again, we've structured the findings there along the lines of Entman in terms of looking at how they perceive definitions, drivers, causes, and so forth. And there was some divergence there, which is interesting, but just to give an overview of some of the consensus points that all participants more or less agreed upon. And these were that food poverty, broadly speaking, can be attributed, if not universally, to macro-level factors, and that this impacts on the ability of families and individuals to afford or access sufficient quantity or quality of food. Those most likely to be perceived as affected by food poverty included families, and particularly single-parent families, the unemployed, the working poor, migrants, older people, and students, and more or less in that order. The perceived consequences of food poverty tend to centre around mental health aspects rather than on the physical health impacts per se. And in terms of the measures to address the issue, most involved the voluntary sector responses, and while acknowledging at the same time that there was greater intervention needed at a governmental level. So in effect, kind of a lot of overlap with what we saw in the media pieces. Where things get a bit more interesting, I think, at least, is when we drill down a little deeper among participants into their perceptions of and approaches to, in the case of the media professionals, to reporting on the topic. So among the findings were that media professionals expressed a preference for case studies. They also thought that food banks provided a good hook, and that personal stories of families, and particularly women and children, were perceived to be more relatable and more impactful. They also perceived the topic to be rather complex, which is probably fair enough, it is complex. And they also highlighted the lack of objective data. There was also a perception amongst media professionals that, in general, viewers and readers are not particularly interested in questions of policy. The members of the public, or at least the ones that we spoke to, alternatively expressed a preference for expert voices, and this included people working in these voluntary roles who are seeing the issues day in, day out. In terms of case studies and whatnot, they perceived that stigma was a major barrier to obtaining case studies, and they understood this. And so they also expressed a desire to see a more solution-focused type of coverage. We saw that people working in the community organisations really believed that sensational reporting was likely to be more engaging to the public. But they also noted their own role, and I thought this was quite interesting, in contributing to surface level reporting on food poverty. So they were slightly wary of engaging with service users to obtain case studies for news reporting, and the reason attributed or given for this was because of the power dynamics that exist between service provider and service user. And finally, with policymakers, they perceived that media coverage very often eluded some of the systemic issues underpinning food poverty. They saw it as largely a reactive to day-to-day issues, and also believed then that there was a tendency to construct somewhat of a dichotomizing narrative of good poverty and bad poverty. Okay, so how do we make sense of all of this? So across all of the data sources we analysed, but especially the media and interview data, we saw that food poverty was almost universally acknowledged as an aberrant and like an undesirable phenomenon. So everyone agrees that no person should ever go hungry, and no person should ever experience food poverty. As the Minister said, in a wealthy country, in an advanced economy, this shouldn't be something that happens, right? So there is almost universal agreement on that. Following from this, the four core interlinked and overlapping discursive frames can be identified, and these account for the how and the why, at least, of food poverty from a textual point of view. And from these four core frames, then, a variety of perspectives flow in relation to appropriate responses to the problem. So the four core discursive frames included political dysfunction, where food poverty arises because of failures in the political sphere. So this might include absence or shortcomings in leadership, failure to adequately legislate, or to develop and implement appropriate policy. Really a failure to respond to the needs of the population. Then we see an economic dysfunction frame, where food poverty is exacerbated by external factors, as we saw in those clips earlier: inflation, wage stagnation, unstable or low-paid employment. And we see then that how this is constructed as giving growth to the rise of this new precariat, the working poor that we saw constructed in a couple of those clips. And these are people then who are described as having, despite adhering to social norms and expectations, nonetheless still find themselves at the margins. Then we see the social dysfunction frame, so where food poverty is linked to a breakdown, and these are linked and overlapped, by the way, these frames. How food poverty is linked to a breakdown in the social contract. So there's significant barriers to securing the basic fundamental needs, housing, childcare, and so forth. And then the nature of modern employment creating additional knock-on effects in terms of accessing quality food. Then we have the individual dysfunction frame, which we actually saw a lot less frequently, both in the interviews and in the media analysis. But this is where food poverty would be linked more neutrally to knowledge and skills deficits, and then more negatively to perceived lifestyle choices. So addiction, gambling, and so forth. So elements of all of these frames, to some extent, were evident in the interviews and also across the media sample as well. So, for example, almost all of the people we talked to agreed that cost of living crisis and inflation, so that economic dysfunction piece, and that the housing crisis, that social dysfunction piece, that all of these are significant factors in food poverty. And at the same time, then, there's differing opinions among participants onto whether lifestyle, so that individual dysfunction, or the structural political dysfunction, were additional salient drivers. However, those who lean more towards understandings of food poverty that include individual dysfunction would show greater endorsement of individual and community level interventions. And those who lean more towards the economic or political dysfunction would show a greater endorsement more broadly of those policy-led interventions. But as we saw, this wasn't particularly true of the media sample on the media discourse, where really the dominant lens is charity. So that was the kind of overarching lens through which these frames were organised around. So I've drawn a few quotes to illustrate some of the analysis and our observations from the findings. So firstly, to note that this is really one of the big findings or the key findings of the research, is that what we see when food poverty is communicated is that it's downstream solutions to upstream problems. So print media coverage in particular was contradictory in this regard, and there was almost twice as much focus on third sector solutions to policy-led solutions. And you've just a couple of examples there, quotes from our sample. What we found that there was several explanations for this finding, and that these were alluded to by participants during interviews. So one of the things that we found was that there's an apparent codependency, and yet a degree of mistrust as well between third sector voluntary organisations and news media professionals, and that this was perceived to be contributing to the surface level reporting. So we see in the quotes here that on one hand you have a policy manager of a national charity talking about the media wanting to be spoon-fed, and on the other hand you have an editor discussing a reliance on charities while expressing a need for more objective accounts. Other challenges then that were noted, which may account for this surface level reporting, include the perceived complexity of the issue, which I mentioned previously as well. So poverty, more broadly, we know kind of represents a complex, wicked problem, and to which the solution is which is ideologically contested. And we can kind of see that in some of the in the two quotes here, and particularly in respect of people's perceptions of drivers and solutions. So here on the one hand, we have a policymaker who rejects the depoliticization of the issue and this idea that you can have a skills-based approach alone to solve the issue. While on the other hand, you have a local radio presenter who believes that it's an issue of individual rather than governmental responsibility. So when we think about framing of the issues, we need to consider what is missing. And insight into this was also garnered from some of the discussions that we had with stakeholders. So for instance, the lack of any real discussion about concrete solutions was highlighted by a few members of the public. While a broadcast producer here observed that it would be helpful to have more expert voices from research and academia to contribute to the research and give that context that was perhaps missing. Another key finding then from analysis and from the research is that in addition to the absence of those external expert voices, the voices of those experiencing food poverty also tended to be missing. And there were a few case studies and there were people who featured, so it wasn't universal, but broadly speaking, that was the case. So media professionals expressed a need for case studies and that they really wanted to have case studies to tell these stories. And they expressed a preference for families, women and children. I covered that a little bit earlier. But this approach raises questions about the ethical engagement of people, of vulnerable populations and people experiencing poverty, particularly when service providers are obliged to act as gatekeepers so that news professionals can access individuals. And a further question then arises is what function does it serve to have these case studies? What function does it serve to have people in these reports? So on the one hand, you might have people, or people might argue that increased visibility might help to destigmatize food poverty. But on the other hand, it can also be argued that representational strategies can potentially produce certain biases and certain stereotypes. And if there's a preference, as there seems to be among editors and journalists and professionals, for showcasing the plights of single mothers and children, it's questionable whether the former rather than the latter is achieved. And this might be particularly the case where reporting was ideologically driven one way or the other, as we kind of saw with the quote from the local radio presenter. You know, there's potential then for responsibilization of people for their situation, and that's kind of problematic. And then we know from evidence elsewhere as well, from studies conducted in the US, for example, in the 80s, that where there is a focus on individual victim rather than on a thematic or general focus, that people do tend to assign greater responsibility to the individual rather than to society at large. So again, we need to consider whether having case studies, whether that creates impact or whether it complicates that, and whether it complicates kind of advocating for effective measures. So what's the alternative? So one approach that arose from analysis was this idea of a shift towards a rights-based paradigm. So it's worth pointing out that both Ireland and Northern Ireland are signatories to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and that these protect the right to adequate food. Both nations are also signatories to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the aim of which, or one of the aims of which, is to end hunger by 2030. So as signatories to those conventions and to the SDGs, the governments of each nation does have a responsibility. So they're duty bearers. And as duty bearers, they need to ensure that the rights of their citizens to adequate nutritious food are protected and fulfilled, protected, respected and fulfilled. But what we saw then was that media reporting on food poverty was really largely absent of this contextualization of the issue as a human rights problem as well. So only 11% of newspapers, for example, mentioned food as a human right. And then more disappointingly, perhaps, was the lack of emphasis or the lack of reference to human rights within the policy documents that we came across, where again, even in the policy documents, there is this charity lens, a disproportionate focus on those charity-led recommendations. And there's nothing wrong with charity. Charity is perfectly laudable as an expression of social solidarity, as an expression of altruism, but it says nothing of the right to food, and it says nothing of human rights. And this potentially elides the obligations of policymakers to protect that right. So we have to think about what the frame is then and how it sort of impacts how we think on things. And if we think about how such a reframing might shift perspectives, we could look at how the adoption of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities has changed how people with disabilities are viewed. So from previously being viewed as objects of charity, the CRPD has had the effect of refocusing and shifting perspectives so that people with disabilities are acknowledged as individuals with rights to dignity, to participation in society, and to autonomy. So we haven't seen a comparable paradigm shift in respect to the right to food, but I think it's worth considering the impact that that might have and how it might change our mindsets and how it might change broader mindsets to public and politicians and so forth. So just to recap, because I think I'm a little bit over time. So analysis of the study findings showed that food poverty is invariably presented as an upstream problem, but reflected through that lens of charity. The solutions highlighted then are almost always downstream of the issue. Coupled with this charity lens, we saw that food poverty is framed as a consequence of some sort of dysfunction, be it political, policy, social, economic, or individual. And then the aspects that are made salient very often depend on the ideological perspective of the text producer or the speaker. In terms of representation, we found that power disparity is a relevant factor when it comes to using case studies, so that overall representation of people experiencing poverty is problematic and even potentially counterproductive. So finally, we suggest that a rights-based paradigm might offer a fruitful mechanism for reframing communications on the topic. So just to briefly go through some of the recommendations that we made, and these are elaborated on a little bit more in the report, but just to give an overview. So these include that advocates work together to develop a position statement, and I think the Minister mentioned a shared language for communicating food poverty on the island of Ireland. We also strongly suggest that a rights-based approach should be adopted. There's also a recommendation that a resource database, including an expert panel from academia, should be made available to media professionals. This could potentially include lived experience experts, but there should be media training involved, and there really needs to be a code of ethical practice developed and applied. In terms of further research, we think there's a need to improve the data landscape more broadly. We saw this come up again and again in discussions, particularly with journalists. And that we also think that a research action project would be warranted to collaboratively develop best practice guidelines. There's no point in wagging our fingers at media professionals and say you have to do it this way. You need to bring them along, and they need to be involved in developing good codes of practice for reporting on poverty, on food poverty. Finally, and along the same lines, is scope to develop training workshops for media professionals and for journalism students, get them while they're young. And while awareness raising on the issue of food poverty and the right to food might also be warranted. So just very briefly to acknowledge our fab research team. So Sinead and Aideen are here, and I think Claire and Porrick and Colette are probably listening online. Staff and students at the Health Promotion Research Centre who were very supportive of the study, and the Safefood personnel who were extremely supportive of the study and showed us great support throughout, and of course all the participants and the stakeholder panel who contributed to the study. We couldn't have done it without them. So thank you very much.